For a long time, games were fairly abstract, and you can't learn much from an abstract game. But then along came war games. But how did war games evolve, and who helped to move them along? Let's find out. Now, to be fair, war games have probably been around for as long as people have populated this planet. In fact, authorities have traced wargaming back to chess, which probably originated somewhere, they think, in ancient India. And one historian even notes that the pieces used in some of the original Hindu games represented the same four elements of an army. They represented elephants, horses, chariots, and infantry. And the supporting framework of the chessboard symbolized a wall of a fortified city. So, as mentioned previously, those games were highly abstract. But let's fast forward out of ancient India and move to the 1600s in maybe Prussia, Europe. During the 1600s, a man named Christoph Wilkman decided to shake up chess a bit by replacing the square grid system with a circular system and increasing the number of pieces and making those pieces more aligned with actual military positions. Based on his adaptation, many other adaptations and modifications to the boards were made, but they were still all pretty, abstract. The board didn't really look anything like an actual battlefield. And this went on for a while with tweaks and adaptations. But then in 1780, a professor at a college of military science named Johann Christian Ludwig Hellwig invented the concept of wargaming with the publication of his book. Now, the title was loosely translated into Attempt to Build Upon Chess, a Tactical Game which two or more persons play. So, yeah, he did not do the best job at coming up with book titles. He should have shortened it. But he was a great game designer. What Hellwig did was add more movement around the board, and he also created novel victory conditions, and this is really important. He created a realistic setting for the game rather than an abstract board. The board on which his version of the game was played was more realistic than any other previous boards. In fact, he had marked those boards for terrain, he had obstacles on there. He had added things that were actually on the battlefields of the day. Hellwig added the idea of a variety of types of troops as well, and the idea that some troops were stronger or weaker than others, cavalry versus infantry, just like the modern game Risk. He added a strength system to gaming which hadn't been there before. The realistic terrain and the addition of different types of troops or game pieces now made the game asymmetrical. No longer did the game require each side to have the same number of pieces lined up across from each other. In 1803, an updated version of his long-titled book was released. Someone must have had a word with him because he shortened the title simply to Das Kriegspiel, which literally means the war game. In that publication, he innovated the game one more time. Here, he created a new way to resolve battles by accounting for things like unit direction. The game also broke up movement and battle into two phases within the same turn. Today, that's the concept of actions, which exist in lots of games, like Pandemic, for example, where you can take up to 4 actions per turn. As the 1800s progressed, cartography became better and better, and soon the idea was born that the game board should actually be a map with the added advantage of scale. So now, mock battles taking place on a map with a sense of scale allowed the players to judge how far actual troops could move, how far cannons could shoot. It was a huge innovation. When that was correlated with actual data from battles or drills, the war game experience could be highly realistic. The previous games, which were highly abstract, now became teaching tools or even tools for planning actual battles. Then along came George Leopold von Reichwich, who innovated once again and who some call the founder of war games. So we have a little bit of controversy about who really founded them. But here he actually made a big contribution. So we like historical controversy, right? So anyway, George Leopold did a great deal to advance the war game concept. In college, he developed an unofficial, unauthorized version of Hellwig's war game, so we like them. And then he played with his friends and even continued playing that version of the game through mail after he graduated from college. Then George Leopold and his friend decided to get rid of the grid system altogether in about 1810 and replace it with another movement system. He and his team also devised highly realistic topographical terrains, shaping mountains out of sand, little trees, highly realistic, but at the time, and even now, really hard to mass produce. But in 1812, he created a one-off version of the game for the Prussian king. His masterpiece was a 6-foot wide flat tabletop with movable pieces, which were 2 to 3 inch squares where you could set up rivers and mountains and houses and other topographical features. It was an awesome board game, but again, not easy to mass produce. So a few years later, Reiswich's son, named George Henrik Rudolf Johann von Reiswich, took up his dad's line of work and once again innovated on the concept of the war game. He actually added some key elements and wrote about them in 1824 in a new edition of Kriegspiel. His innovations including the use of umpires and the use of dice. The umpire was an important role. They set the stage for the game, dictated the size and composition of forces, and served as the arbitrator between the moves of each side, meaning that a side would devise a move and then tell the umpire, who decided what to tell the other side, and that would result in the move. Often the umpire was a senior officer who was given the discretionary power to steer the game through situations that would have been too complex for a rigid set of rules. It added a sense of flexibility. Gameplay worked like this. One side would draft an order in writing, playing the role of a military commander, and then transmit that order to the umpire. Then the umpire would interpret the orders and tell the other side what they needed to know, and the game would unfold. This allowed for all kinds of things like mismatched troop strength and for practicing various maneuvers such as retreats or advance or even sneak attacks. Now, I want you to keep the concept of the umpire being objective and fair-minded in the back of your head, because we'll talk about a little bit later one of the downsides of having an umpire when you're trying to predict the outcome of battles. So just file that away. We'll talk about it later. Anyway, one of the other innovations that was introduced was that instead of placing all the pieces on the board at the beginning of the game where everybody could see everything, the umpire would only allow pieces to be placed on the board of which the other side was aware. So if one side didn't know about a massing of troops or a sneak attack, those troops would not be visible to them, sometimes until it was too late. That's the fog of war. So the umpire had the final say. They were the rules. If players didn't like critiques or criticisms of the umpire, that shouldn't have happened until after the game. And remember, in the 1800s, people seemed to be a little more polite. The other change was the addition of dice. The dice introduced randomness and uncertainty and probability. Now, players had to think about the probability of outcomes. The dice had different outcomes on their faces, which were more or less likely to appear depending on what was rolled, reflecting actual battlefield probabilities that were known at the time. At one point, the chief staff general, Karl von Muffling, explained, "This is not a game. This is a school for war." So a pretty powerful endorsement for a learning game. And his assessments must have been right, because in the subsequent wars in 1866 and 1870, the Prussian military basically kicked some serious butt. They were highly successful, and they weren't as well equipped as other armies. So everyone said, "Hey, we've got to adopt this Kriegspiel thing. It seems to be pretty effective." And even a version of it was used in the American Civil War. Okay, so that's a lot of information on wargaming, but it's critical because wargaming sets the stage for all kinds of training and learning games in the future. War games have been used to teach military strategies, predict potential outcomes of battles, and have even been used to been modified, as we saw before, in corporate settings, right? where you can go corporate competitors instead of enemies, right? Corporate situations. So that's really important. But when war games are misused, they have dire consequences, which we'll discuss a little bit later on, where intimidating an umpire to make an unwise ruling actually ended up not so good for the Japanese in World War II. So stay tuned. When do war games get your military into trouble? When you bully the umpire. Let's see how a little umpire intimidation backfired on the Japanese as they were planning the now infamous Battle of Midway. In the last episode, we reviewed the history of wargaming and discovered how Georg Heinrich Rudolf Johann von Reiswich added the concept of an umpire, which dramatically changed wargaming altogether. But umpires are human, and that can cause some problems. Let's see how. In the 1940s, the Japanese were heavily into using both war games and non-conflict oriented strategy games, like war games but no violence, to plan and predict military, political, and economic outcomes of actions taken by the government. In fact, according to researcher Arata Ishikawa, in the 1940s, the Japanese had created 2 institutes designed specifically to explore different concepts and to communicate in a non-linear fashion strategies, tactics, and consequences using war game approaches with including umpires. Ishikawa writes, a National Graduate School of Gaming was established under the administration of the civilian prime minister on September 30th, 1940. Until the school closed on March 31st, 1945, due to the worsening of the war situation, over 100 participants had graduated from the school. At the institute, one of the primary tools was the policy economic gaming simulation administered at the institution. When the Allies won the war and conducted a tribunal, one person speaking as a witness for the Allied forces prosecution, who represented the faculty of the Institute, gave the following testimony, which is an exact quote from the English record of the proceedings of the tribunal dated October 29th and 30th, 1946, as recorded by Ishikawa. The aim of the so-called tabletop discussions was generally in accord with the education objective of the Institute. It was believed by the Institute that lectures alone were not sufficient in carrying out the aims of that institute. And for that reason, in order to make more practical the training of the mental facilities, mental efficiency, as well as the efficiency of cooperative action, and to develop overall efficiency in their studies, certain hypothetical conditions were conceived and different branches were studied. So, really fascinating. A note of interest is that Ishikawa asserts gaming simulations were not for educational use, but rather for research and practical orientation, meaning that the games were designed to play out possible outcomes of policy and economic decisions. The playing of the simulation games was designed specifically to examine possible outcomes of actions taken by the Japanese in political realms, economic realms, and of course, military actions. But because these games were run and designed and refereed by humans, they were not perfect predictors of outcomes. In fact, during preparation for the Battle of the Midway Atoll, the Japanese were conducting one such tabletop simulation game at the Total War Research Institute. Some of the commanders viewed the wargaming simulation as an opportunity to lobby for the battle and perhaps cause them to become overconfident in their assessment of what would happen. Extensive military gaming preceded the formation of the armada that was going to converge on the Midway Atoll and finally finish off the job that was started in Pearl Harbor. During the gaming exercise, the Japanese attack on Midway was a success. However, this was largely attributed to the fact that Admiral Ugakai, a pro-invasion officer, was presiding over the games. A great description of the flaw in wargaming appears in the book by Elliot Carlson titled Learning Through Games, A New Approach to Problem Solving, published in 1969. Carlson explains that apparently in one playing of the simulation war game for the Midway attack, the admiral set aside several rulings that were made by more objective umpires, rulings that would have resulted in a less favorable outcome for the Japanese. In fact, in one example, hoping to stifle objections against attacking Midway, the admiral changed all the verdicts on the anticipated air battles and altered all of them in favor of Japan, which they were very successful, but not completely. In another playing of a war game simulating the battle, the Japanese fleet was bombed by the American aircraft while its own planes were in the air attacking Midway. One umpire, an air staff officer, ruled there had been 9 hits on the Japanese carriers. The admiral didn't like that outcome, so he reduced the number of hits to 3, with only Kaga being sunk with Akagi slightly damaged. In short, the admiral was using games to argue a set of predetermined convictions that he had about the battle, rather than use the war game to investigate possible reactions of an enemy and to help predict outcomes and to prepare for the unexpected. In the actual battle, the Akagi and Kaga and the Soryu all received devastating hits and were made inoperable. And of course, the Japanese did not win the Battle of Midway. Now, other larger factors contributed to the ultimate loss of the battle, such as the Americans having broken the communication code and some war doctrine decisions made by one of the Japanese carrier fleet commanders that didn't allow for creativity, and some tenacious attacks by the Americans. But one can't help speculate how the seemingly positive outcomes of the gaming simulation might have influenced the upper command's expectations of the battle and caused the Japanese to be just a little more overconfident in their abilities than they should be. But the Japanese were not the only force to use wargaming during World War II. In fact, the American Admiral Nimitz, who commanded the U.S. fleet in the Pacific, is credited with having said the war with Japan had been enacted in the game rooms at the War College by so many people and in so many different ways that nothing that happened during the war was a surprise. Absolutely nothing, except the kamikaze tactics toward the end of the war. We had not visualized those. So, wargaming, pretty comprehensive on both sides. But bullying the umpire is not the only way that strategic games can go wrong. In recent times, the United States ignored the outcome of a wargame simulation, and the consequences were even more dire. More about that in the next episode.